Senate Bill 1220 is commonly known as the Domestic Terrorism Bill, but it really is a due process bill. Common, ordinary Idahoans are being unfairly labeled and tagged as domestic terrorists. If I were to ask you today, is domestic terrorism a crime under Idaho law? You would presumably say yes, when in fact there is no definition of domestic terrorism under Idaho law. Senate Bill 1220 seeks to fix that. As citizens of our state and country, we defend our ability to air our grievances to a local school board, a city council meeting, or a taxing district, or any level of government, national or local. Other examples include people being stopped from flying home after a vacation, having failed background checks when they're applying for jobs. People have had their phones and computers searched. Do you happen to have a disagreement with your neighbor? You better watch out. He may rat you out as a terrorist on the National Terrorist Hotline that was set up during the Obama administration. If you think this is all fantasized and imagined, consider these facts. The terrorist screening data set has grown from 120,000 people in 2003 to over 2 million people in 2021 or 2023. NSA officials have acknowledged that many people don't belong on that list, but they don't have the staff to remove them. The government reports, again I'll say the government reports, tens of thousands of complaints from people being treated like terrorist suspects. The Department of Homeland Security themselves have admitted that 98% of those reported complaints were subjected to false positives, flagged because their names were similar to others. A report just last December details how a Stanford PhD student fought a 9-year court battle to prove her innocence when the FBI finally admitted that she was watch listed because an agent had accidentally checked the wrong box. The list goes on and on. While we cannot compel the federal government to act or not to act, Senate Bill 1220 can prevent state and local government officials from acting on these false accusations, and in these cases, prevent the feds from coming in and telling the local sheriff to take a hike. Now, to wrap up my statement, I'd like to address some common questions that you will hear regarding this bill if you haven't heard them already. First of all, why does the definition of domestic terrorism, as defined in this bill, have to be tied to a foreign terrorist organization, or an FTO? The short answer is that the only way we can keep these things from happening to innocent Idahoans is to tie the definition to a foreign terrorist organization. Why? Current definitions of terrorism and domestic terrorism are ambiguous and inconsistent across agencies, jurisdictions, and allow misuse by non-government organizations, media agencies, bureaucracies, and law enforcement. These abuses begin as accusations, such as hate or extremism, and are used as justification to treat political opponents as enemies of the state. They are essentially weaponized against citizens. In the absence of a federal, congressionally authorized definition of domestic terrorist, everyone is making up their own definition of what defines a domestic terrorist. If we do not tie the definition of domestic terrorist to an FTO, ordinary citizens will continue to be targeted. Furthermore, even foreign terrorist organizations have notice that they are suspected, while average ordinary Americans are walking around having no idea that they are being tracked, followed, and suspected.
This bill was passed in 1982, as I'm understanding from having reviewed the minutes, and it was there was a concern with a group up in North Idaho that had made threats and was intimidating people, and And so with the bill being passed, it was represented by Attorney General's office and a number of other sheriff's associations, several prosecutors, that this bill was necessary in order to discourage that kind of activity. If this bill, if the amendment to this law is passed now, what do we have in code that will address those who might want to engage in domestic terrorism, such as happened back in 1982?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gannon, thank you for that question. I appreciate that. It's a very important question. And yes, that law was passed a long time ago. And since then, there have also been other additions to the law. And if you will look in Title 18, Section 3322, you will see that that specific activity is criminalized and prosecuted under the law. So, thank you.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me write that down. Which section did you say?
18-3322. And it specifically cites bombing, in case you're interested.
And, Mr. Chairman and Representative Pickett, does that, so are you saying then that the bulk or the meat of the laws that we passed back in 1982 remain in force, and you're just dealing with a peripheral issue or a side issue, or how would you characterize it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gannon, I characterize it as protecting due process under the law. Since that time, there's been a lot of things going on in the world, as we all know. And in the meantime, statutes are not taking care of the situations that involve the weaponization of labels. And our purpose is to define terrorism, and specifically domestic terrorism, to the extent that individuals are allowed due process under the law.
Representative Rowe?
Mr. Chair, good Representative Pickett, I went back and I actually watched the Senate video of as he debated on the floor. Thought that might give me some help today, because I too, when I read through the bill, thought the foreign terrorist was quite a stretch, especially for here in Idaho. But I want to ask the question so that it's not something that I know the answer to, because it certainly seems, though, that what struck me as a weird way, putting that foreign terrorist in this bill is the way to put the sideboards on it, so that we're actually given the definition to terrorists, because everything else is still illegal, that we have laws for. If you firebomb somebody, that's against the law. If you're slandering, libel somebody, that's against the law. We have laws for that. And I understand, and you discussed it a little bit with regard to how some of these terms were used, and you'd have to check the receipts, but as we heard reports of FBI naming, Moms of Liberty, Moms for Liberty, as terrorist groups because they ended up at the school boards asking questions. It seems that really what you're doing here is giving it a definition, not creating any new laws, but giving it a reason to be different than what we already have. Is that really the case here? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Rolton, I appreciate the question, specifically because I had the same concern. When I first read this bill, when I first understood or read this concept, I struggled with tying it only to the foreign terrorist organizations until I read further and understood further that there is no way to protect individual citizens, ordinary innocent citizens, unless we tie it to foreign terrorist organizations. Currently, there is no congressionally authorized list of domestic terrorists, and therefore, we have no other alternative at the present time. In the meantime, until that time may come, if it does, ordinary citizens will continue to be targeted, flagged, tagged, whatever term they want to use, whatever term any NGO or any other agency or bureaucracy deems sufficient to accomplish their purposes. we have to remember that a lot of these things are being done to stigmatize or to intimidate people who have political opponents with differing political ideologies. And that's the motive behind a lot of these cases. And we're simply wanting to protect due process for those individuals. As I mentioned earlier, if you're a foreign terrorist organization, you're aware that you're on a list. A lot of American citizens aren't even aware that they're being suspected. And that's a huge difference. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jenny Bateman from Rupert, Idaho, and I am in favor of this bill. I serve as the chair for Minidoka County Republican Central Committee, and more importantly than that, I am a mom. In 2022, following the National School Board Association's letter asking that threats to school boards be labeled as domestic terrorism, we as moms and dads in Minidoka County ask our legislators to clearly define terrorism and domestic terrorism in Idaho statute to protect parenthood and our right to be part of the political process. Following the NSBA letter, the FBI actually designated a counterterrorism threat tag for parents based on examples of their disagreement with school boards from that letter. This past year, I had the unfortunate experience of being the target of my school board chair's rancor, and now I worry that she may have turned my name into the FBI and added me to that domestic terrorism threat tag. You are treated differently when labeled a domestic terrorist. You are no longer a citizen or even a common criminal. You are an enemy of the state with no rights and no due process. I have no idea if I am on that list. And it's frightening to think that I may not find out until a no-knock raid with my kids in the house, as moms in other states have had happen to them, that's when I would find out I'm on that list. Parenthood transcends party lines, and all parents should know that they are safe to participate in the political process without being intimidated by concerns of ending up on a domestic terrorism threat tag list and wondering when the dark night, no-knock raid is happening. Please support our parents and due process afforded to every American by passing Senate Bill 1220 to clearly define terrorism and domestic terrorism. Thank you.
CSG is a nonprofit whose mission is to train leaders in individual, relational, and societal self-governance, regardless of their partisan affiliation, sexual orientation, and more importantly, the pigmentation of their skin. CSG has over 6,500 students in 43 states. 1,269 of those students are from Idaho. 11 CSG Idaho students from 6 different Idaho cities requested that we come here today to testify concerning the term domestic terrorism. What is the difference between a crime and domestic terrorism? Is rape a crime or domestic terrorism? Surely the rape victim was terrorized. Is murder a crime or domestic terrorism? Surely the murder victim was terrorized. Is racial supremacy a crime or domestic terrorism? Surely the racism victim was terrorized. Idaho ACLU recently stated that SB 1220 excludes white supremacists from Idaho's domestic terrorism definition. Why is there a need to create separate domestic terrorism code for white supremacy, but not for all racial supremacy, rape, or murder, etc.? A MSNBC commentator recently stated, instead of dealing with the white supremacist threat, Idaho State Legislature would rather outlaw a label. My organization certainly hopes the Idaho State Legislature will choose to balance civil liberty with public safety and outlaw, or at a bare minimum, severely restrict the political weaponization of the label domestic terrorism.
The National ACLU has publicly noted a highly problematic trend of both the federal and state government using domestic terrorism powers to punish dissent, both state and federal. I was designated a domestic terrorist by the federal government, by the FBI. I went through 2 years of not knowing that, and then I was later indicted. I eventually found my actual designation from the FBI that said I was a Tier 3 domestic terrorist. I then looked at my charges, and I wasn't charged as a domestic terrorist, so I started wondering why and what it actually meant. And After I went through my due process after being charged, I was acquitted on most charges. I took a plea agreement for a misdemeanor and I went home. I started to study domestic terrorism and the charges versus the label versus everything. It's a very convoluted mess everywhere. There's multiple definitions, whether that's an NGO, private definition, or whether that's a government definition or just an internal law enforcement definition. I won't go into all of that because we've hit a lot of that federal stuff. I would like to look at the state that's using it right now. It's being used in Georgia right now. 40 people were charged with domestic terrorism. Some of those people may have committed violent acts, crimes. Some of them were just there to protest. They've all been labeled, designated, and charged, and now they're further using that within the media to vilify anybody else showing up to protest. What I believe is that these terms and charges aren't picked up unless it's in order to further politicize an event.
Mr. Parker, I have a question, just hypothetically, how this would play out. So we have a good friend of this committee that we've had testify a lot here, who just got in some trouble in Washington, D.C. Our friend Shiva was just in trouble for protesting in Washington, D.C. How would this law help him?
If you can answer that, go ahead.
Well, I could. If this law was in place, either in Georgia or here, it would stop people from being charged with domestic terrorism unless they had a connection to an FTO. I believe that he probably is on a list federally and doesn't know it, and that's the problem. No transparency. It's the same as what this lawyer in Georgia said. You know, she was quoted as, she's representing 4 people who are charged over there in Georgia, and she said there's multiple charges that could have been used, but they're using this charge to further politicize an event and vilify anybody joining that political cause right now. I think it's highly problematic. I haven't seen anything like that in Idaho yet, but this is more preemptive. This is the idea that we're not going to do that. We're not going to pick up that political label weapon and further politicize events. If somebody blew up a building, they would get charged with 3322, use of a weapon of mass destruction. That's bombs, regular bombs, is covered in that definition. The judge could use his discernment to give up to a life in prison. That's the same as the TCA. So the idea that we're going to further charge people, enhance that chargement, and possibly punish them twice, that's not how it should work. That's not, because they're only going to pick that up to politicize it.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Parker. I may have missed it, but how did you find out that you were on the terrorist list?
Thank you, Chair. Representative Gallagher. During my due process, I was given discovery, and within that discovery, I found an FBI document that had me designated as a Tier 3 domestic terrorist. So it was an actual part of a file that showed their internal designation. I'm working now with the Weaponization Committee in DC to look at that internal designation and how it filters down to the states through the fusion centers. And problematically pops up on our local law enforcement screen when they pull somebody over. So they believe, they're ex-FBI agents, the investigators for the Weaponization Committee, they believe this is bad practice. It's leading to possible bad intelligence to the officers, let alone the civil liberty violations that are possible. They've talked about expediting a hearing on that in the Weaponization Committee. I'm hopeful that they do that.
Follow up?
For a follow-up, Mr. Chair and Mr. Parker, so I would have no way of knowing if me or anyone on my family is on the domestic terrorist watch list. Is that correct?
Correct.
Go ahead and answer through the chair.
Oh, sorry, Chair. Representative, that is very correct, and very problematic. We don't know if we're on that list. We don't know how to get off that list. We do not know the scope, because Congress has never given it, as to how you get on that list, what you would have to actually do to get on that list. None of those things are set, and the transparency is key. Thank you for touching on that. If an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, a foreign terrorist, is curious, he can literally hop on Google and look it up, and the State Department's going to tell him how we feel. I can't do that. Shiva can't do that. These people that are protesting over in Georgia, they can't do that. It's very problematic, and what 1220 does is put the proper safeguard in place so that that can't happen.
One more?
One more follow-up, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Do we assume that the people that are being detained due to the January 6th event, do we believe that those people are probably on this list?
Chair?
Answer if you're able.
I am able, Chair. I've actually brought evidence with me to DC of individuals from J6 who have been designated where they acquired what comes up on that screen in the NCIS when he gets pulled over by local law enforcement. We have a copy of what comes up on the screen. I brought that to DC in furtherance of my point to show how bad intelligence filters down into the state, causing a possible dangerous situation for all involved.